The boy's body jerked violently against the sun-baked asphalt, his limbs contorting in spasms that sent festival-goers stumbling backward in shock. Two police officers stood over 13-year-old Marcus Thompson, their tasers still drawn, yellow wires snaking from the weapons to the small electrodes embedded in his Batman t-shirt. The acrid smell of ozone mixed with the sweet aroma of kettle corn from nearby food stalls, creating a sickening contrast that would haunt witnesses for months to come. "Stay back. He's still dangerous," Officer Bradley Morrison shouted to the growing crowd, his voice cracking with uncertainty as Marcus's seizure intensified. The boy's mother, Angela Thompson, pushed through the circle of onlookers, her face contorted in horror and rage. She had been at the face-painting booth just 50 yards away when the commotion began, helping her younger daughter transform into a butterfly. Now she dropped to her knees beside her son, her hands hovering helplessly above his convulsing form. "Don't touch him," Angela screamed at the officers, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's having a seizure. He has epilepsy. You just tasered a child with epilepsy." Her voice rose to a pitch that cut through the festival noise like a blade. The Ferris wheel continued its lazy rotation in the background, its cheerful music now seeming grotesquely inappropriate as Marcus's body gradually began to still. 20 minutes earlier, the Riverside Community Festival had been proceeding exactly as it had for the past 15 years. Families wandered between booths, selling homemade crafts and local produce. Children ran between the game stalls with sticky fingers and painted faces. The volunteer fire department was serving their famous barbecue near the main stage, where a local bluegrass band filled the air with fiddle music. It was the kind of Norman Rockwell tableau that made residents proud to call Riverside home. Marcus had been standing in line for the ring toss game, his allowance money clutched in his palm, when the aura began. The 12-year-old knew the warning signs well. The strange metallic taste filled his mouth, and the world seemed to shimmer at the edges like heat waves rising from summer pavement. He had learned to recognize these moments, taught by his neurologist and reinforced by years of experience. But today, surrounded by the chaos and sensory overload of the festival, the familiar precursors felt more intense than usual. "Mom," he called out, turning to scan the crowd for Angela's familiar red cardigan. But the faces around him blurred together, and the sounds of the festival seemed to echo strangely in his ears. The teenage girl running the ring toss booth looked at him with concern as he swayed slightly, his eyes losing focus. "You okay, honey?" she asked, leaning forward over the counter. But Marcus couldn't process her words anymore. The partial seizure was beginning, causing him to stare blankly ahead and make repetitive movements with his hands. To most observers, it might have looked like he was spacing out or daydreaming. To someone predisposed to suspicion and ignorance, it looked like something far more sinister. Karen Whitfield had been having what she would later describe to her book club as a perfectly lovely day, until she noticed the black boy acting strangely near the game booths. At 53, Karen had lived in Riverside her entire life and considered herself an expert on proper behavior and community standards. She had been observing Marcus for several minutes from her position at the PTA information table, her suspicions growing with each passing moment. "Something's not right about that child," she muttered to her co-volunteer, Janet Mills, while straightening the pamphlets about upcoming school board meetings. "Look at him. He's clearly on drugs or something worse. The way he's staring and moving his hands like that, it's not natural." Janet glanced over and saw Marcus still caught in the throes of his partial seizure, his movements mechanical and his gaze unfocused. "He does look a bit strange," she admitted reluctantly. "But maybe he's just tired or overwhelmed. You know how kids can get at these events." "Tired children don't act like that," Karen insisted, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when chairing HOA meetings. And look at how he's dressed. That shirt is torn. His shoes are dirty. I bet he's one of those kids from the government housing complex. They bring all sorts of problems into our community." The truth was that Marcus's Batman shirt had a small tear because he had snagged it on a fence post while walking to school 3 days earlier. And his shoes were dirty because he had been helping his mother plant flowers in their small garden that morning. But Karen saw what she wanted to see, her prejudices coloring every detail into evidence of her predetermined narrative. As Marcus's partial seizure progressed, he began to walk in small circles, his movements becoming more pronounced. The teenage volunteers at nearby booths watched with growing concern, but none of them recognized the signs of a medical emergency. To Karen, however, it looked like threatening behavior. "I'm calling the police," she announced, pulling out her iPhone with decisive flourish. "That child is clearly under the influence of something, and he could be dangerous to the other children here. It's my responsibility, as a community leader, to protect our families." "Karen, maybe we should try to find his parents first," Janet suggested weakly. But Karen was already dialing 911, her finger stabbing at the numbers with righteous determination. "911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's calm voice contrasted sharply with Karen's agitated breathing. "I'm at the Riverside Community Festival, and there's a young black male who appears to be on drugs," Karen reported, her voice pitched higher with manufactured urgency. "He's acting very strangely, making erratic movements, and he looks dangerous. There are families with small children everywhere, and I'm concerned he might become violent." "Can you describe his behavior more specifically, ma'am?" the dispatcher asked, her fingers already typing the details into the emergency response system. He's staring into space with a blank expression, moving his hands repetitively, and now he's pacing in circles. It's clearly drug-induced behavior, and I'm worried about what he might do next. Please send officers immediately." The dispatcher dutifully recorded Karen's observations, coding the call as a potential public disturbance with possible substance abuse involved. Within 4 minutes, 2 police cruisers were racing toward the festival grounds, their sirens wailing across the peaceful suburban afternoon. Officers Morrison and Patricia Valdez arrived at the festival with their adrenaline already heightened by the dispatch description. Morrison, a 5-year veteran of the force, had responded to several drug-related incidents in recent months and was primed to see threat where there might be none. Valdez, newer to the job but eager to prove herself, followed her partner's lead as they approached the game booth area. Marcus's partial seizure was beginning to transition into something more severe. The confused wandering was giving way to the unmistakable signs of a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. But to the approaching officers, who had been told to expect a dangerous individual under the influence of drugs, his increasing agitation looked like aggressive posturing. "There!" Karen called out, pointing dramatically at Marcus as the officers approached. "That's him. I told you he was acting strange. Look at him now." "Son, we need you to stop what you're doing and put your hands where we can see them," Officer Morrison commanded, his hand resting on his weapon. But Marcus couldn't hear or process the command. The seizure was building toward its climax, and his conscious mind was no longer in control of his actions. "He's ignoring you!" Karen shouted from her safe distance. "I told you he was dangerous. He's probably high on something." "Son, stop moving and put your hands up," Morrison repeated, his voice louder and more aggressive. When Marcus continued to move erratically, the officer drew his taser. "He's not complying. Looks like he might be PCP or something similar." Officer Valdez circled around to Marcus's left side, her own taser now drawn. "Sir, you need to get on the ground immediately," she shouted. But Marcus was beyond hearing, beyond comprehension. his brain caught in the electrical storm of a grand mal seizure. The festival crowd had begun to gather, forming a loose circle around the unfolding drama. Parents pulled their children closer, uncertain what they were witnessing, but sensing danger. The bluegrass band had stopped playing, and an eerie quiet had settled over the grounds, broken only by the officers' shouted commands and Karen's continued commentary from the sidelines. "Tase him," Karen urged. "He's going to hurt someone." Angela Thompson heard the commotion from the face-painting booth and looked up to see a crowd gathering near the games area. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she recognized the familiar signs of community disturbance that often surrounded her son's medical episodes. She had lived this nightmare before, though never with such dire consequences looming. "Emma, stay right here with Mrs. Rodriguez," she told her 7-year-old daughter, whose butterfly face paint was only half complete. "Don't move until I come back." Angela pushed through the gathering crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs as she caught sight of the police officers with their tasers drawn, aimed at her son. Marcus was in the full grip of his seizure now, his body rigid and then convulsing, completely unaware of the weapons trained on him. "Wait!" she screamed. But she was still 20 yards away when Morrison pulled the trigger. The electrical current hit Marcus at the worst possible moment, just as his seizure was reaching its peak intensity. The additional shock to his already overloaded nervous system caused his body to collapse in violent spasms that were unlike anything the officers had seen before. "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with him?" Morrison muttered, lowering his taser as he watched Marcus convulse on the ground, with an intensity that clearly went beyond the normal effects of electrical shock. Angela reached her son and immediately took control of the situation with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had dealt with hundreds of seizures over the years. She knelt beside Marcus, protecting his head with her hands, while being careful not to restrain his movements. "Call an ambulance," she shouted over her shoulder, "and get those things away from him." She gestured angrily at the tasers. "He's epileptic. This is a medical emergency, not a criminal situation." The crowd's mood shifted palpably as Angela's words sank in. Faces that had been fearful and suspicious moments before now showed horror and dawning understanding. A child with a medical condition had been treated like a dangerous criminal, and they had all been witnesses to the injustice. "Medical alert bracelet," Angela said to Officer Valdez, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Check his wrist. It says epilepsy in big letters. It also has my phone number and his doctor's information." Valdez knelt down and examined Marcus's left wrist, where a red medical bracelet was clearly visible despite the taser wires. The engraving was exactly as Angela had described. Marcus Thompson, epilepsy, emergency contact, Angela Thompson, followed by a phone number and additional medical information. "Oh God," Valdez whispered, her face going pale as the implications hit her. "Morrison, he's got epilepsy. We tasered a kid having a seizure." The festival grounds fell silent, except for the approaching wail of ambulance sirens. Marcus's seizure was beginning to subside, but the damage had been done. The electrical shock from the taser had intensified and prolonged what should have been a manageable medical episode, potentially causing complications that could affect him for the rest of his life. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived with the paramedic team and immediately took charge of Marcus's care. As an emergency physician with 15 years of experience, she recognized the signs of post-ictal confusion complicated by electrical shock. Marcus was breathing but unconscious, his vital signs unstable in ways that suggested serious trauma. "How long was he seizing, Doctor?" Chen asked Angela, while her team worked to stabilize Marcus for transport. "It started as a partial seizure maybe 10 minutes ago," Angela replied, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. Then it became generalized, right before they shocked him. "I've never seen him convulse this violently." The electrical current can intensify seizure activity and cause additional neurological trauma. "Doctor," Chen explained grimly, "we need to get him to the hospital immediately for emergency neurological assessment." As the paramedics loaded Marcus onto the stretcher, the festival crowd watched in stunned silence. The joyful community celebration had been transformed into a scene of medical emergency and moral reckoning. Children clung to their parents, confused by the sudden shift from fun to fear. Adults whispered among themselves, piecing together what they had witnessed and beginning to understand the magnitude of the injustice. Karen Whitfield stood near the PTA table, her face flushed with embarrassment and defiance. As more details about Marcus's medical condition became public knowledge, the crowd's attention began to shift toward her role in initiating the police response. Several festival goers who had overheard her 911 call were sharing the details with others, and anger was building like a summer thunderstorm. "You called the police on a sick child," accused Maria Santos, whose own son played on Marcus's soccer team. "You told them he was dangerous when he was having a medical emergency." "I couldn't have known," Karen protested weakly. "He was acting strangely, and I was concerned for everyone's safety. I did what any responsible citizen would do." "Any responsible citizen would have tried to help," shot back James Martinez, the festival coordinator, "or at least asked if the child needed assistance before assuming he was a threat." The crowd's murmur grew louder and more agitated as people processed what had happened. Marcus Thompson, a well-known and well-liked member of the Community Youth Soccer League, had been tasered by police because a woman's prejudices had transformed a medical emergency into a criminal threat in her mind. Dr. Amanda Foster, Riverside's only pediatric neurologist, arrived on the scene just as the ambulance was preparing to depart. She had been enjoying the festival with her own family when she received the emergency page about a pediatric seizure complicated by electrical shock. "Angela, I'm so sorry," Dr. Foster said, recognizing her patient's mother immediately. "I'll meet you at the hospital. We'll do everything possible to minimize any additional trauma." "Will he be okay?" Angela asked, her composure finally beginning to crack as the full weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. "Marcus is strong, and he's had good seizure control for the past year," Dr. Foster replied carefully. "But electrical shock during a seizure can cause complications we'll need to monitor closely. The next 24 hours will be critical." As the ambulance pulled away with its precious cargo, the festival ground erupted in heated discussions about what had just occurred. The incident had exposed fault lines in the community that many residents preferred to ignore. Questions about racial profiling, police training, and community responsibility swirled through the crowd like autumn leaves caught in a windstorm. Pastor Michael Williams, from the Riverside Community Church, approached the microphone on the main stage, his deep voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "Friends, we've all witnessed something today that challenges us to examine our hearts and our community. I suggest we pause this celebration and spend time in reflection and prayer for young Marcus and his family." The festival activities ground to a halt as the gravity of the situation fully sank in. Food vendors began closing their booths, game operators packed up their equipment, and families gathered their belongings in subdued silence. What should have been a day of community joy had become a day of community soul-searching. Officer Morrison stood near his patrol car, completing his incident report with hands that shook slightly as he wrote. The weight of his actions was beginning to settle on him like a lead blanket. He had been a police officer for 5 years, had undergone crisis intervention training, and had even taken a course on dealing with mental health emergencies. But in the moment, faced with dispatch information about a potentially dangerous individual, he had acted on assumptions rather than assessment. "We screwed up bad," he said to Officer Valdez, who was also struggling with the aftermath of their actions. "That kid was having a medical emergency, and we treated him like a criminal." "The call made it sound like he was on drugs," Valdez replied, but her words lacked conviction. "How were we supposed to know?" "We should have assessed the situation instead of assuming," Morrison said bitterly. "We should have looked for medical alert jewelry. We should have tried de-escalation instead of going straight to force." News of the incident spread rapidly through Riverside's social media networks and neighborhood groups. By evening, "Justice for Marcus" was trending locally, and national disability rights organizations had begun taking notice. The story had all the elements that capture public attention: a child, a medical emergency, police misconduct, and racial undertones that couldn't be ignored. At Riverside General Hospital, Marcus remained unconscious in the pediatric intensive care unit. Dr. Foster and her team were monitoring him closely for signs of additional neurological damage caused by the electrical shock. The seizure itself had lasted longer than usual, and the taser deployment had occurred at the worst possible moment in the seizure cycle. "His brain activity is showing some abnormal patterns," Dr. Foster explained to Angela and her husband Robert, who had rushed home from his job at the power plant. "We're keeping him sedated while his nervous system recovers from the trauma. The next scan will tell us more about any potential long-term effects." Angela sat beside her son's hospital bed, holding his hand and listening to the steady beep of the monitors that tracked his vital signs. Marcus looked so small and vulnerable surrounded by the medical equipment, his Batman shirt replaced by a hospital gown covered in cartoon animals. The taser marks were still visible on his chest, angry red welts that served as physical evidence of the injustice he had suffered. "This never should have happened," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our son was having a seizure, and instead of getting help, he got attacked by the people who are supposed to protect him." "We'll get through this," Angela replied, though her own faith was shaken. "Marcus is strong. He's dealt with epilepsy his whole life, and he's learned to adapt to challenges. He'll adapt to this too." Back at the festival grounds, cleanup crews worked in unusual quiet, packing away the remnants of what should have been a joyful community celebration. The contrast between the cheerful decorations and the somber mood created a surreal atmosphere that reflected the day's jarring transformation from celebration to crisis. Karen Whitfield had left the festival shortly after the ambulance departed, but not before several community members had confronted her about her role in the incident. The confrontations had been heated, but not violent, with people expressing their anger and disappointment in terms that left no doubt about how they viewed her actions. "You saw a black child acting differently, and your first instinct was to call the police instead of offering help," accused Jennifer Park, whose daughter attended school with Marcus. "That says everything about your character and nothing about Marcus's behavior." "I was protecting the community," Karen had replied defensively. "I couldn't have known he had epilepsy." "You could have asked," Jennifer shot back. "You could have looked for his parents. You could have offered assistance. Instead, you assumed the worst and called in armed response against a child." The confrontation had escalated until festival coordinator James Martinez intervened, but not before Karen's actions had been thoroughly documented by multiple cell phone cameras. The videos would later become crucial evidence in both the criminal investigation and the civil rights lawsuit that followed. That evening, the Riverside City Council held an emergency session to address the incident and its implications for the community. Mayor Patricia Reynolds, who had been at the festival with her own grandchildren, opened the meeting with a statement that acknowledged the gravity of what had occurred. "Today, our community failed one of our children," she began, her voice carrying the weight of collective responsibility. "A young man with epilepsy was treated as a criminal threat instead of receiving the medical assistance he needed. This failure occurred at multiple levels, and we must address each one if we hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future." The council chambers were packed with residents who had witnessed the incident or heard about it through social media. The mood was somber but determined, with community members ready to demand accountability and change. Several speakers addressed the council during the public comment period, their words painting a picture of a community grappling with hard truths about bias, assumptions, and institutional failures. Dr. Foster addressed the council about the medical aspects of epilepsy and the importance of proper recognition and response to seizures. "Epilepsy affects 1 in 26 people," she explained. "Seizures can look frightening to those unfamiliar with the condition, but they are medical emergencies requiring assistance, not law enforcement intervention. Today's incident shows how dangerous it can be when medical conditions are misunderstood and mischaracterized." Police Chief David Rodriguez appeared before the council to address the officers' response and announce immediate changes to department protocol. Officers Morrison and Valdez have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, he announced. "We are also implementing mandatory crisis intervention training focused specifically on medical emergencies and disability awareness." The investigation into Karen's 911 call revealed a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the festival incident. Neighbors came forward with stories of her calling police on children of color for minor infractions that she ignored when committed by white children. Her homeowners association complaints followed similar patterns, targeting families based on subtle biases that she defended as maintaining community standards. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after the festival incident, District Attorney Margaret Chen announced that criminal charges would be filed against Karen Whitfield for filing a false police report and reckless endangerment. The charges carried potential jail time and significant fines, sending a clear message that abuse of emergency services would not be tolerated. Ms. Whitfield's call to 911 was not based on any actual emergency or criminal behavior. DA Chen explained at a press conference. She observed a child experiencing a medical episode and chose to characterize it as dangerous criminal activity. Her false report directly led to the use of force against a minor having a seizure, endangering his life and causing serious bodily harm. The charges sparked debate in some circles about the criminalization of 911 calls, but disability rights advocates applauded the decision as necessary, accountability for discrimination disguised as public safety concern. The case would become a landmark precedent for prosecuting false emergency reports motivated by bias. Meanwhile, Marcus began showing signs of improvement on Wednesday afternoon. His seizure activity had stabilized, and he was responding to voices and touch. Dr. Foster cautiously optimized his medication regimen while monitoring for any lasting neurological effects from the electrical shock. "Marcus, can you tell me your name?" Dr. Foster asked when he first opened his eyes and seemed alert. "Marcus Thompson," he replied slowly, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "Where am I? Why does my chest hurt?" Angela squeezed his hand gently. "You're in the hospital, sweetie. You had a seizure at the festival, and some people made some very bad decisions about how to help you, but you're going to be okay." As Marcus's condition improved, the community mobilized around his family in ways that restored some faith in human nature. The soccer league organized fundraisers for his medical expenses. Local restaurants delivered meals to the hospital. Children from his school created get-well cards that covered an entire wall of his room. The incident had also sparked important conversations about disability, awareness, and inclusion. The school district announced new training programs for teachers and staff on recognizing and responding to medical emergencies. The police department implemented policy changes requiring officers to check for medical alert jewelry and consider medical causes before using force in cases involving altered mental status. Pastor Williams organized community forums focused on confronting bias and building genuine inclusivity. "This tragedy has shown us that good intentions are not enough," he said during one session. "We must actively educate ourselves about the diverse needs and experiences of our neighbors. Ignorance is no longer an acceptable excuse for harm." The legal proceedings against Karen moved forward with methodical precision. Her attorney attempted to argue that she had acted in good faith based on what she observed. But the evidence painted a different picture. Cell phone videos showed her making disparaging comments about Marcus's appearance and background before calling 911. Her social media history revealed a pattern of posts that demonstrated clear racial bias. The Thompson family filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Karen, the city, and the police department, seeking damages for Marcus's medical expenses, pain and suffering, and the violation of his constitutional rights. The lawsuit alleged that Karen's actions were motivated by racial discrimination and that the police response was excessive and unreasonable. Marcus was discharged from the hospital after 5 days, though he would require ongoing monitoring for potential long-term effects of the electrical shock. His seizure threshold had been lowered by the trauma, requiring adjustments to his medication and lifestyle. But his spirit remained unbroken, sustained by the overwhelming support from his community and his own remarkable resilience. The festival, canceled in the immediate aftermath of the incident, was rescheduled for 2 months later with significant changes. The new format included disability awareness booths, medical emergency training demonstrations, and presentations by local families affected by various conditions. Marcus and his family were honored as special guests, and he threw out the ceremonial first pitch at the softball tournament. "This festival is about celebrating our whole community," Mayor Reynolds announced at the reopening ceremony. "That means creating space for everyone, understanding each other's needs, and protecting our most vulnerable members instead of targeting them." Karen's trial became a focal point for national discussions about bias, emergency services, and community responsibility. The prosecution presented evidence of her pattern of discriminatory behavior, while the defense argued that she had genuinely believed she was protecting public safety. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both charges. At sentencing, Judge Maria Gonzalez addressed Karen directly. "Your actions transformed a child's medical emergency into a life-threatening encounter with law enforcement. Your call to 911 was not motivated by genuine concern for public safety, but by prejudice and assumption. This court sentences you to 6 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, and 500 hours of community service with disability advocacy organizations." The sentence sent shockwaves through communities across the country, where similar incidents had occurred without consequences. Disability rights advocates hailed it as a victory for accountability, while some critics argued it was too harsh for someone who had been trying to help. However misguided her approach, Officers Morrison and Valdez faced departmental discipline and were required to undergo extensive retraining before returning to duty. Morrison ultimately left law enforcement and became an advocate for police reform, speaking at training seminars about the dangers of assumption and the importance of thorough assessment in crisis situations. The civil rights lawsuit was settled for a substantial sum that would cover Marcus's medical expenses and educational needs, while funding community programs focused on disability awareness and emergency response training. The settlement also required the city to implement comprehensive reforms to police training and emergency response protocols. 1 year after the incident, the Riverside Community Festival featured a new tradition, the Marcus Thompson Inclusion Award, recognizing individuals and organizations that worked to create welcoming, accessible spaces for people with disabilities. Marcus himself presented the first award to Dr. Foster, whose advocacy had led to improved emergency medical training throughout the region. A year ago, I had a seizure at this festival and was treated like a criminal, Marcus said, speaking into the microphone with confidence that belied his 13 years. Today, I stand here as proof that communities can change, that people can learn, and that something good can come from something terrible. But the real heroes are the people who stood up for me and worked to make sure this never happens to another child. The transformation of Riverside's community culture extended far beyond disability awareness. The incident had forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, assumption, and the ways that fear and prejudice could masquerade as civic responsibility. Book clubs studied implicit bias. Churches held discussions about social justice, and schools implemented curricula focused on diversity and inclusion. Karen served her jail sentence and completed her community service, working with the Epilepsy Foundation to educate others about seizure recognition and appropriate response. The experience fundamentally changed her worldview, though it came at tremendous personal cost. She lost her position on the school board, faced social ostracism from former friends, and struggled to rebuild her identity around principles of empathy rather than judgment. "I thought I was protecting the community," she said during a victim impact session as part of her probation requirements. "I realize now that I was the real threat to community safety. My assumptions and biases nearly cost a child his life. I have to live with that knowledge every day, and I'm committed to spending the rest of my life making amends." The changes implemented in Riverside became a model for other communities grappling with similar issues. The police department's crisis intervention training was adopted by agencies across the state. The festival's inclusive design principles influenced event planning nationwide. Most importantly, the community's response to the crisis demonstrated that accountability and healing could coexist with justice and progress. Marcus continued to thrive despite the ongoing effects of his trauma. His seizures remained more frequent than before the incident, requiring careful management and lifestyle adjustments. But he used his experience to educate others, speaking at schools and community groups about epilepsy awareness and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand the full humanity of every person. "Living with epilepsy means that my brain works differently sometimes," he would tell audiences. "But that doesn't make me dangerous or less valuable than anyone else. What happened to me was wrong, but it taught our whole community important lessons about seeing people as they really are, instead of as we assume them to be." The annual festival became a celebration not just of community spirit, but of community growth. A reminder that even the most painful experiences could generate positive change when people committed themselves to learning, healing, and justice. The ring toss booth where Marcus had been standing when his seizure began was now permanently marked with a plaque recognizing the importance of medical emergency awareness and community support. As the sun set on another successful festival, now in its 3rd year since the incident, Mayor Reynolds reflected on the journey her community had traveled. "We learned that being a good neighbor means more than just keeping your lawn mowed and your music turned down," she said. "It means actively caring for the well-being of everyone around us, especially those who might be vulnerable or different from ourselves. The legacy of that terrible afternoon lived on in policies changed, minds opened, and lives transformed. Marcus Thompson's seizure had become a catalyst for community healing and growth, proving that even the darkest moments could illuminate the path toward a more just and compassionate society. The festival continued each year, stronger and more inclusive than before, a testament to the power of people to learn from their mistakes and build something better from the fragments of what was broken.